Whenever you rent or buy a video, you need to be sure that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
Do sit down. We're just about to have some tea.
Ladies and gentlemen, please do not panic, but scream. Scream for your lives.
Hail weirdos, the kettle's boiled. Welcome to Tea for Terror, where we take a favourite horror film and dissect it over a nice cup of tea. I'm your host, Andrew Graves, and my guest today is here to tell us that everyone is now part of his dream. Everyone! Welcome, Jez Conolly. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Andrew. Thank you very much for inviting me on. It's a real pleasure to talk about this film, which is it's got a very special place in my heart, I guess. So I'm always happy to sort of chew the fat about this film.
Yes, we'll definitely get to that later. What have you been up to? Have you been working on anything? We'll get into your books in a second, but I was thinking actually before we started this, what kind of a writer am I? I don't know what sort of a writer I am really. I'm not an academic. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a fanboy writer, really. I'm sort of none of the above, really. I used to be an academic librarian, so I've done a lot of the kind of. I'm familiar with academic rigor when it comes to like writing about cinema. I know all about that, so I can do that stuff. But I never really wanted to write stuff like that for publication. I always wanted to be a bit more sort of like passionate about it, bringing a bit more kind of love, for want of a better word, really. And so that's what I try to do. So the things that I've had published tend to be quite sort of subjective. They're not really academic texts particularly, but they do. Hopefully they've got a bit of that sort of rigor that you'd expect from that side of things. But hopefully they represent enjoyable reads and kind of passionate reads, I suppose. So yeah, I've a few things published, but I'm still doing various things. But increasingly, I'm actually writing fiction these days. One of the things I mentioned, I was an academic librarian. I've actually retired last year, so I'm actually a gentleman of leisure these days, which means I can write whatever I want to, and I have been. So I'm still keep my hand in with the non-fiction, but I'm increasingly writing horror short fiction these days. Yeah, I feel the same really. I kind of teach at a university a little bit. I'm not full time or anything. I just do bits and pieces at university, and it's all kind of film related. But I've never really seen myself as academic at all. You know, I wonder what I'm doing there sometimes. I mean, I love it. I really do love it. But I'm like, you know, students will say, I just feel like, you know, I'm not an academic. I'm just here. I'm just ballooning on about films. That's all I'm doing, you know. And it's same with the writing as well. I'm similar to you, really. I don't really fall. I'm not a journalist. I've never really fallen into that category of being a film critic. I don't really do that. I've been very lucky in the fact that everything I've been able to write has been about films that I'm really passionate about and I want to sort of put out there, or it's about a genre or a subject that I get why people do it, and I think you need critics because otherwise you get the art you deserve. But I'm happy for other people to do that. I like to look at things and examine things and offer different opinions, but and do a kind of analysis, if you like, in some ways, but not necessarily an academic one. But it is more
same here. I mean, I like to try and be a bit evangelical with a small e, really, about the films that I really love. And particularly films that I think, you know, what is the audience for a film that I like? You know, can I introduce it to people who may not have seen it before? So one of the reasons, one of the books that I wrote about, one of the films that I wrote a book about was second to the John Frankenheimer film, which I think has got an audience these days increasingly, but I think for a long time it didn't, and it went remarkably underseen. So I was really keen. I was actually keen to be the first person to write a book about that film, a dedicated monograph about that film, which I think I managed to do that. And actually, the same can be said for the film that we're talking about today as well, I think. Although plenty's been written about it, but not one dedicated volume, which is what I managed to pull off. So.
Yeah. So, I mean,
because obviously there is a connection with horror there. So what was your entry point into horror really?
Well, it would be very easy for me to sort of say, which I think probably one or two of your previous guests have said, which is to sort of cite things like the BBC Two weekend double bills, which I'm pleased to say I did get exposed to those, and they were really important to me. And the Dennis Gifford book, I remember getting that one. It was a bank holiday weekend. We went away to Scarborough for the weekend. It was really, really rainy, and sort of cheer me up. My parents bought me a copy of that book, and I sat there in the back of the car reading that. That's great. But anyway, I thought, well, hang on a minute. There's stuff that I got into before all of that, which were my kind of early stages. So I'm thinking about, and there was probably about three different things, really. One of them was a bit of pretext is that my dad used to be a cinema manager. He was a cinema manager for many, many, many years, pre-war and post-war even. And which meant that for the longest time, and you're going to hate me for this, I actually didn't have to pay to see a film until I was about 21. And so I got in to see all sorts of films. And I think the film that I got taken to see, I don't even know if I wanted to see it, but I got taken along. It was a film called Fear is the Key with Barry Newman, who went on to play TV's Petrocelli back in the 70s. This boy who was forever building his house. People might remember that. Anyway, he was the star of this film. But before that film showed, they showed a trailer for a Dracula movie, a Christopher Lee Dracula movie. And I think it must have been the AD 1972, because the timing of it would be about then, sort of late 71, early 72, I think. And so I remember seeing that inadvertently, unexpectedly, and I got this very, very fixed vision of Christopher Lee's bloodshot eyes in that trailer, and it scared that crap out of me. I was being about 6 at the time. I was definitely not prepared for that. So that was one, a very early one. The other thing I remember, we went on holiday to Blackpool one year, about 74, I think it was. And we went to the Wax Museum. Louis Tussauds in Blackpool it was then. I'm not sure if it still is now. And we went into the Chamber of Horrors, and that was pretty bad. I remember there was one sort of tableau of a road traffic accident, which is pretty horrific. And I got kind of shepherded through that a little bit, so, didn't see too much of it. There was a separate bit, which was like a room of anatomy exhibits. And in the brochure they gave you at the beginning, there was a kind of glossy bit to the main public. And then they had this little paper insert with a sort of a numerical list of all the exhibits in this separate section. And my parents thought, well, we paid the money, we want to see what's in there. Just about to take me in. I remember this guy coming out of this area, and he had like a raincoat on, a very serious, pale, white face. And he just said to my parents, "Don't take the boy in there." And it's when you deny. So your imagination, what the hell? And I remember reading through this numerical list of all these exhibits. It's horrific stuff like smoker's lung and alcoholic's liver and all the manner of, genitalia. It's horrific. So I'm actually kind of glad I didn't see it, but my mind went into overdrive at the thought of what I'd been denied seeing. So that was another thing. The other thing, the third thing I remember was there was a joke shop in the town that I lived in when I was a kid. And they were way past my pocket money, but they had on the top shelf this row of full head horror masks on display. I mean, back then they were about £20, which was king's ransom back in the mid-70s. So I couldn't afford them. Every time I went in for I collected a lot of sort of little rubber fingers and things like that, horror props and things. But these masks would look down at me. I thought, one day I'll have some horror masks. I did have one or two later on, but anyway. So that was the third thing that kind of got me into thinking about horror. The only other thing that occurred to me that happened around that sort of time was that it must have been one school summer holiday, and I was, what it was like. You get that kind of certain level of boredom, and you start taking your toys apart to see how they work. And do you remember those laughing bags?
Yes.
It's like a yellow thing. There's a thing inside it, and you could kind of feel it. You press this button, and you could hear this recording of this guy laughing, and that alone was vaguely horrific. But on this day, I decided to take this component out of the yellow bag and have a look inside it. And I flipped a thing, and this was like a little a tiny little record inside, very, very basic technology. Well, there must have been some kind of a stylus inside this component, and it played. And I thought, oh, it's amazing. It's like a little record player. I wonder what's on the other side of the record. So I took it out, put it back in again the other way, and it played Birdsong. I lost my mind. When you're not expecting something like that, it just freaked me out for some reason.
I thought you were going to say there was some creepy voice telling you that I'm going to kill you.
No, that would have been. Yeah, that would have been there. I probably wouldn't be here if that had No, it just, you know, I think that was the reason I wanted to mention that was, I think it kind of developed an appetite for slight oddness rather than necessarily big scares, which I think is appropriate to the film that we're going to be talking about, actually, which is much more about the kind of creeping dread thing rather than the kind of startle, bang horror.
I think you're right. Lots to unpack there, as they say in academic circles. I think, you know,
we're not using that language today, Andrew.
Yeah, no. We're first. I think, you know, this is not a horror thing, but yeah, lovely to hear a Petrocelli reference. I remember it well. I remember Petrocelli as one of my earliest memories. Petrocelli, and yes, and I also remember Terry Wogan like taking the piss out of him mercilessly because he never finished his house. You know, this poor guy in between cases, he only ever got to do his foundations, really. That's about it. I don't know where he slept.
Yeah.
He never finished it. But also, the Louis II swords in Blackpool. Yes, I remember it well. I remember one of my first proper holidays that wasn't with my family, with my first girlfriend. We went to Blackpool. And I remember it for a lot of reasons. You know, Blackpool, as people know who have ever been to Blackpool, no matter what time of year you go, it is the windiest place on the face of the planet. Yes. I had long hair at the time, and I remember every single photograph that we had was just hair across my face because it was so fucking windy. I also remember. It was when we went, it was the day before. We went on the Saturday. The day before was when original Batman 1989 had gone on general release. So that was really exciting. So I went to see that, and I went to see it about 3 times while I was in Blackpool with my girlfriend. And also I was, I still kind of am, but I was massively into Alice Cooper, and Alice Cooper's Trash album came out the same week as well. So that I remember that. But yes, I remember very clearly going to see Louis II swords, and because I was a bit older, I did go and see the bits you didn't see. So yes, I remember the syphilitic members, shall we say, and all
I
that.
didn't like to stay. Yeah.
That is the most impressive part of Louis II sword. I don't know what's there now or whether it's still there, but the other waxworks. I mean, you know, the Beatles and things like that weren't particularly. I think I could knock a Beetle that looked better than the average wax.
I'm sure you probably could. The only thing I would say is that it was beaten in the Dreadfulness Stakes by the one at Great Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth? Yeah. Oh my Gideon! We went there in the mid-70s again, or late 70s. I remember it being terrible then. And I went with a friend in the early 90s just because it was still there. It's gone now, unfortunately, and they still had some very, very old waxworks. The room with all of the kind of the political leaders. There's one of Hitler and one of Mussolini, which are just diabolically bad. How they got away, but I mean, it's hysterically funny, really, but unintentionally.
They were. I mean, some of you just think, why did you even bother to try and fashion these? You may as well have just bought a shop dummy and stuck it in a Hitler
they have
uniform.
They have little name plaques at their feet, so you can recognise. I mean, that's cheating, isn't it? It's just a vague, like, it's a human being. So therefore, it must be Winston Churchill because it says so on its feet.
It's the waxwork version of the bad 1970s impressionist, isn't it? You know, who tells you who they're going to do like 10 minutes before they do it.
Hi, blah blah blah. Here, well, she just told us who you're meant to be.
Oh, how we lived. Yeah. I think we'll go into the film we're going to look at then. So the film we are going to look at is the 1945 Ealing Studios film Dead of Night.
Know this part of the world at all?
No, I've never been here before. like some tea, wouldn't you? Do you take milk and sugar? Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig. Milk and sugar, Mr. Craig.
Still there. So it isn't a dream this time.
I beg your pardon.
Yes, it isn't a dream this time. I must be going out of my mind. You see, everybody in this room is...
So, Jez,
everybody.
When was the first time you came across this film?
So I can give you an exact date, day and time. It was 8:10, Thursday the 19th of May 1977 on BBC Two, courtesy of the BBC Genome Project. You won't be too surprised for that, because I wouldn't actually remember that specific day. But I was thinking back to when I must have first seen it, and that date pretty much tallies with my vague memory of a first screening. It was quite funny actually just to look at the schedule for BBC Two that evening. There was bugger all on, really. I mean, the programme, apart from Play School at about 11 o'clock in the morning, I closed down, Open University, and then some political thing at 7 o'clock. And then you have the movie, and then nothing much happened. There was nothing on. It was practically the only thing on. And this was 1977. So the BBC Two was a really threadbare thing, but even as recent, if you like, as 77, which kind of surprised me a little bit. But yeah, that's when I remember first seeing it. And like I think probably quite a few of your previous guests, I didn't know anything about it at all. It was just some old movie. I think I benefited from the fact that my dad, being a cinema manager, retained this interest in older films. So I don't know whether he'd seen it before, but it got played on the one TV in the house, B77. I didn't have my own telly to watch it on. We had to watch it on the main TV. And I just remember not sleeping very well that night, because this film had this way of implanting anxiety into my mind that I wasn't expecting. It would kind of creep up on you, and you may well agree, but it definitely affected me in a way. And I remember thinking about it a lot for a long time before I then, in the 80s, rediscovered it. I think Channel 4 probably screened it in their early days, and I remember seeing it then and thinking, oh, it's that movie, it's that one. I remember this one. It's this is something a bit kind of special, really. So I always think it. Not only is it the grande dame of British horror cinema, I think it's a keystone in British national cinema. It's a really important piece of work within the Ealing canon. You've got all of the talents there. You've got 4 fantastic directors showcasing what they could do. And I think that was the intention of it. I read something when I was researching an interview or a piece of work by Michael Balkan, the producer. And that's basically what he was saying. He wanted this to be this sort of showcase of all of the talents at Ealing, behind and in front of the camera. And I think that's what they actually managed to achieve. So even if you're not particularly a fan of horror cinema, I think if you're interested in national cinema, it's a film that has to be seen. But apart from anything else, it's the most fantastic entry point for British horror cinema. It predated the Hammer movies by over a decade. It was the precursor for all of the subsequent anthology, all of the Amicus movies that came later on. It's a really important film. And despite the fact that in a couple of years' time it's going to be 80 years old, I would actually say that unlike some of the films that came later on, it retains its power to really frighten. So yeah, I'm a huge advocate of this film.
I love it, and it's I don't think I didn't really see it for the first time till the late 90s, I don't think so. It was one of those films that I kept hearing about, and but I think I think I would absolutely agree with you. I think it is a keystone certainly in British horror cinema. Like you said, there wasn't really anything. And I think that's to do with, if we go back to the mid-30s and the introduction of the H for Horror certificate. For those that don't know, it was basically effectively saying if you were under 16, you weren't legally allowed to go and see horror films. So that sounds like a very natural thing that we'd maybe have now. But then it was like, film going experience was if you were alive you can go and see a film. But then they introduced this H for Horror certificate, which had a massive effect, not just on homegrown films, but it meant that studios like Universal in America would kind of for a little bit stopped making horror films because the British market was so big, they couldn't sell them over here. So they, for a little while, they stopped making so many horror films, and then it gradually picked up again when they re-released Dracula and Frankenstein as a double bill. But over here, so there wasn't a lot. So you'd had, even before that, there wasn't a lot of British. I mean, you got the sort of dark thrillers like Todd Slaughter and things like that, and you'd had, people, they blagged kind of Boris Karloff to do The Ghoul in 1933, but it wasn't, they weren't necessarily doing anything. And I think a little bit later on, just before Dead of Night, you had films like The Halfway House, which was kind of leaning towards, it's very supernatural. I wouldn't necessarily say it's horror, but it was kind of it feels like a precursor for Dead of Night. Obviously, it's got certain two of the actors are in it as well, and so it's got that kind of leaning in there. But I think also with Dead of Night, I mean, we'll get into the kind of the detail in a second, but it is that now, I will guarantee if say BBC4 did a documentary about Ealing Studios, I bet you this film wouldn't even get a mention, or if it does, it'll be a sentence. And because they are, again, it's this part of. No, I'm not saying the Ealing comedies weren't brilliant, and they're absolutely amazing films. But Ealing was bigger than that. They did other stuff, It's a little bit like, not quite as bad, but it's a little bit like Hammer. Hammer is known for the horror films, and quite rightly so. But they did all the stuff. They did all the genres. They did war films. They did, historical stuff. They did thrillers. They did all this kind of stuff. So it's kind of this partly with Ealing, I think it's this revisionist thing that it's only like, those comedies they did, that's an Ealing film. But this is an incredible film. Not only, like you said, did it kickstart British horror, I think this is way before. I mean, Hammer were around, but they were doing other things. They weren't doing horror films at this point. And like you say, in terms of what Amicus were doing later on, I mean, a few years after this, you had things like Monkey's Paw, which were playing around with the anthologies format. But Amicus really took this idea and really blew it up and used that as their format for their films.
I mean, in a way, I feel like it sort of sat in abeyance until Amicus came around and thought, "Oh, let's do something with it." Interestingly, when I was researching for the book, I got the sense that it didn't really perform spectacularly at the box office, which it may well be that Ealing decided it wasn't the start of a new cycle of films that they wanted to explore, particularly because it wasn't a great commercial, sort of huge commercial set. I don't think it did reasonably well, but I don't think it was spectacular success commercially. But I think that might be to do with the fact, I mean, it was released in the first week of September 1945, so it's just after VJ Day, obviously a little while after VE Day, but I think people were still very much in kind of a wartime mindset when that film came out, and so I still don't think there was a huge appetite amongst cinema audiences for films that were going to scare them, because they've been shitting themselves for the last 6 years, haven't they? So why would they pay good money to be frightened by a film? So I just don't think it found its large natural audience at the time it came out. But I'm really I'm almost kind of grateful that it did get made when it got made, because I think it actually has some almost unconscious and indirect things to say about the 1940s in Britain, about the role of men in society. Quite a few of the male characters are sort of almost a bit reduced, and the lesser the shells of their former selves sort of thing. Psychologically, there's a lot of stuff going on there which I think was troubling. A lot of stuff around anxiety, and I think also sleep deprivation as well. I mean, it's no accident that the film's opening credits open in front of one of those Henry Moore drawings of a figure in the underground sheltering from the bombs.
Yeah.
in London, and I think there's something about troubled sleep, which runs through a lot of the stories in this film, and I think that's not an accident. It's something they wanted to explain. They want to kind of, as I said when I started to talk about it, it kept me awake first time I saw it. There's something disquieting about it, something unnerving.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, not to kind of overanalyze, but it's, this, it was made in 1945. Most people didn't see it till sort of 46, so it's kind of, it's in the post-war period. But, effectively, I've never been through a world war, thank God. But it's kind of like, the whole country would have been, they went through this thing of relief, but then I guess the collective national sort of post-traumatic stress was kicking in. But also, not only did you have that kind of that momentary relief, the Second World War's over, but then very quickly you were plunged into the sort of Cold War, and suddenly, in this, I think this is why later on first of all you have this kind of this sort of overhang of the Second World War and all those kind of worries, but then you've got this kind of relief, but then you've got the idea of looking forward, the war that we've just won, that suddenly seems safer compared to a World War III, which could happen. It's a fucked up time. I think it's a really odd sort of situation, and
it's a curious few years, isn't it? Really, before the 50s came along, and
yeah, because I think the other thing you get is the war films from that period as well. So from the late 40s, early 50s, you get some sort of classic stuff, but a lot of it is certainly from a class point of view, it's very much trying to reinvent the war as a middle class thing, and a lot of those films aren't about sort of being on the front line. They are about prisoners of war, and it's kind of, and it almost feels like a lot of those films are they resemble more sort of boarding school films. They're trying to escape, but it doesn't feel any more serious than that. And again, it's this kind of recreation. Let's celebrate the war we've just won, because looking forward is quite troubling. And I think, if you compare us to, say, Germany, who lost the war, effectively, if you look at a lot of German culture and German music, especially, look at that krautrock and stuff like that. It's very forward thinking. It's very looking forward. Whereas a lot of our pop music, which was brilliant, but you can see, particularly in the 70s, it's very much looking back. It's very much kind of World War II imagery and stuff, and that kind of it's looking back rather than looking forward. I think our country's fairly unique in that we tend to look back rather than forward.
One sort of subgenre of films that I keep meaning to get interested in or see more of is the German, I think they call them the rubble films of kind of late 40s, early 50s, where they were literally making films in amongst the ruins of the cities. I've seen very little of those films, but it's interesting, the fact that filmmakers were still compelled to make movies despite the parlous circumstances they could have made. And actually, I think that's a very positive reflection upon those people that they did that. Quite amazing. But yeah, you can certainly see the kind of post-war British cinema, that sense of slight beginning to puff out the chest of kind of nationalist, well, we won, and starting to kind of happen a little bit. And I think that carried on for quite a few.
Yeah, because I mean, again, yes, obviously this country was bombed, and a lot of people were literally living in bomb sites or next to bomb sites. So there was that idea of damage to this country, physical damage. But in comparison to some other parts of the world, maybe we got off. I don't want to belittle it, but slightly lighter than some other countries. So if you look at something like Italy, a lot of their infrastructure was destroyed. So this is why you end up with like neo-realism, because it was like filmmakers recognizing, like you were saying about Germany, they still wanted to make films, but they realized they had to have more handheld cameras, get on the streets, employ non-professional actors, and take it back out. So before the war, you'd had these kind of very mediocre sort of white telephone films that were just, very middle class and very sort of beige and, you know, not particularly that interesting. And then suddenly after a war, there is this trying to reclaim their identity, and they create these kind of more working class, more sort of ordinary films about ordinary people. So it's, but we, in some ways, we had that kind of, like you said, that national oomph. You know, we'd won, or we'd been part of the Allies and we'd won. So there was this sense we could look back with kind of, you know, false fondness for what they'd just been through. You know, even though a lot of people still going through rationing.
A lot of received pronunciation can be found in Dead of Night. That's one of the things that when I show the film to people who haven't seen it before, I always sort of preface it by saying, please be aware that it's made in 1945, and most of the characters will speak in cut glass English, which is sometimes quite hard on the ears to fully kind of grasp. Now, that's apart from the main character, Walter Craig, played by Mervyn Johnson, of course, is Welsh. And there's quite an interesting thing in there, I think, and it's something that I kind of explore a little bit in the book about, you know, views of people within the country who were a little bit less than the middle class, shall we say, or from parts of the country which weren't necessarily associated with that part of those, you know, more middle class parts of society.
Yeah, I mean, it obviously, I think that what this film does is, like we said, even though there had been kind of anthology films before, and they've been very, you know, back in the silent days, you had a few anthology films, but I think this really sets up the rules for a proper portmanteau anthology film, in that we have we've got a classic, we've got a house, so we've got a location where characters assemble. So we have a linking narrative, a linking or overarching story, linking narrative, which then splits into, then we get stories from people in that location. So each of the stories becomes a separate part of the film that is linked by this narrative, you know, this Walter Craig coming in and claiming that he's dreamt all this before. And then we have the sort of conclusion where, you know, like a lot of the Amicus films, this is not necessarily as on the nose as some Amicus films, but it is literally characters, or a character realizing that they're kind of in hell, and they're on a loop, which is a fucking terrifying concept, really. Not necessarily for that character, because he doesn't know, he's just getting hints of it, but for us, the audience, it's like, fucking hell, this is just going to go on and on and on for all eternity. And what on earth has he done to deserve it?
Yeah, that was the element for me, that, you know, the big takeaway was that just thinking about that, just thinking about this character who is in this potentially eternal loop, this Mobius strip of existence of is it a dream? Maybe it's a dream, maybe it isn't, but he's going to relive everything over and over again, which is terrifying.
My good man, think nothing of it. I'm just about through with that cheap ham anyway. Oh. Temper. You'll be sorry for this later, you know.
Yes, suppose I will.
How would you describe the sort of structure and the plot and the different segments, and what is it about, what are the kind of key moments, and how does it, you know, how does it play out, and why is it sort of interesting?
Well, I'm glad you referred to the structure there, because I've always thought there's no accident that the central character is an architect, Walter Craig, in the film, because for me anyway, when he actually enters into Pilgrim's Farm, the farmhouse, it's almost like the individual stories are rooms within that building, and we as the viewers, we pass through them, we go into them, and we kind of see things, and then we come out the other side. So it's almost like we're being led through this succession of rooms in this house, and we do see, we mainly see this sort of, I guess, a kind of just a living room space within the cottage. But we get some really interesting shots of the scene, the rafters, the exposed beams. So it's a very kind of claustrophobic house, quite small windows, leaded glass windows. That sense of being within this space and a little bit trapped, quite increasingly trapped actually. But the stories that
different characters relate to Walter Craig kind of are a way of passing through not just the plot but also the space of the film, if you like. There's a certain kind of three-dimensionality to the experience of watching it. You feel like you're actually wandering around this spooky house. I have a really fun story to tell actually related to this, actually, that when I was researching for the book, I think I actually found out through Twitter at the time. There's a guy called Simon Ralph, and I made contact with him, and he was the son of Michael Ralph, who's the art director on Dead of Night, and subsequently worked quite frequently with Basil Dearden, who was one of the four directors of the film, on a range of different projects afterwards. So he was a really lovely guy. He's actually passed away, unfortunately, now, but he's a lovely guy. I got to know him, and he invited me over to his house in Bradford-on-Avon because he had over 100 scanned photographs of his father's work, but he didn't know whether he had any drawings that would say that were created for Dead of Night. And he actually was really keen for me to try to identify these because he just wanted to know what they all were. And so when I went along on the train, I got off the train and I walked along. And this house where Simon Ralph lived was a converted farmhouse. So I had the weirdest sense of my own, sort of, I feel like I've been here before. It was a very eerie sense of arriving at this house, which mirrored the movie, actually. The great thing was we were able to identify about a dozen of these drawings from Dead of Night, about 8 of which actually feature in the final book. And I don't think they'd been published before that. So that was a fantastic find. But going back to what I was saying about the architecture of the film and the buildings, you can absolutely see how this film was designed to feel really quite claustrophobic. A lot of the very, very kind of narrow and enclosed spaces, and they seem, with the lighting that they use, they seem to get narrower and closer and tighter until, at the end, as I'm sure you know, kind of it turns left and goes all insane, really, doesn't it? So architecture is crucial, I think, to this movie.
It's weird, actually, because I recently went to see Saltburn. I don't know if you've seen that, but that is about, again, it's a character going to a particular manor house to stay, but it's interesting. It's got its faults. I liked a lot of it, but the interesting thing is that the director's chosen, I mean, it's a digital production, but it's in a 16mm sort of format. So what you've got is all these grand, you've got, lots of land, and you've got this grand house and these grand rooms, enormous. But because it's filmed like that, we instantly feel the claustrophobia within these grand places. Yes. It's a really interesting way of looking at it.
This has been an interesting development in recent cinema, I think, is a return to a kind of a squarer picture ratio. I mean, I think of something like The Lighthouse, so you've seen The Lighthouse.
Yeah.
Very kind of like square. You're somehow seeing less. I think for some other films, ratio films, is that you feel more immersed in them somehow, and you become less conscious of the edges of the frame. You feel yourself falling into them somehow more. Whereas with a CinemaScope movie, it's so bloody wide. Your head, you're getting neck ache from looking at either end of the picture. I don't want to focus on if you want to focus on the story and the plot and the characterization, I think there's something to be said for having the narrower picture ratio, which of course this movie made in the mid-40s definitely has that.
Yeah, well, I mean, someone like Mark Jenkins more recently, he's taken it to the nth degree, really, because he's using like literally old film stock and then doing all the sound in sort of post-production, really. So you get in this really sort of, exaggerated kind of Foley and all this kind of stuff, and it has this real they are very modern films, but they have this very old-fashioned charm as well. They're brilliantly done, I think, and it's easy to be cynical and say, it's just using it, but no, they're done with such passion, and the aesthetic is really important. But something like Bait especially is just really, really nice. But N.S. Main as a kind of folk horror-ish type haunting sort of story is brilliant as well. Yeah, and I think you're right. It is that back, like that closed space. It's almost kind of like making big places feel small and feeling confined. That's the essence of horror, I think. It's not, this is what people don't understand. And this is possibly why people don't, modern horror fans perhaps wouldn't necessarily respond to this, because it's not about characters wading around in oceans of blood or anything like that. It's not about gore. It's nothing to do with that. This is what you mentioned earlier. This is the creeping dread. And I think that part of what makes this film so effective is because it doesn't necessarily have one tone. We have comic sections. We have, although, the golfer section, which is often criticized and is often sort of seen as being more throwaway. I'm not the first person to say this, but if you think about what that film is, that story is implying, it's probably the most disturbing out of them all, really. This idea,
in a way, yeah, it is. It's also, I think, it creates a brilliant kind of false step or false sense of security, relative security, before it hits you with the final story, which is for many people is the most memorable, the ventriloquist dummy story. So it serves a purpose, but also back at that point in time, I think a lot of films, there was a certain degree of audience expectation for a sense of variety, really. So you've got a song, you've got, is it the Hula Luba song sung at the beginning of the ventriloquist dummy scene? So it's a little bit of musical. You also got a little bit of comedy with, the golfing story. So that's what audiences are to some extent expecting. So to modern audiences, it might seem like the weakest one because it hasn't got those same kind of gothic trappings. But I think it's got a role to play. I've never been one of these people that criticises it. It serves a purpose.
No, it's great. I think they're all really good, and I think they all fit perfectly together in this weird jigsaw. And I think the other thing that's really deceptive about it. I mean, obviously you will understand, and you'll have an understanding of this because of the book and everything. But I think it's brilliantly done. You don't notice it the first time. You have to watch it a few times, but the way that this is put together visually is it's incredible. This is what it doesn't get credit for a lot. There's a lot of brilliant visual foreshadowing in this film, and it's not about. So now you could kind of film most of the film digitally or CG, and then you could go back and then redo this and make it look as though we planned this. But no, this was actually filmed in the and all of these sections, a lot of them were filmed by different directors, but it comes together so well. Imagine having 4 different directors now and having something so brilliantly constructed that works as all those pieces work perfectly well together.
It's pretty seamless, really. You struggle to tell who's made what, which is as it should be, if you ask me. But another thing I love about it is that it deals in this is part of the creeping dread thing. It deals in a lot of near silences quite often, which isn't really talked about that much in horror cinema writing, particularly. But silence or near silence can be an incredibly powerful tool. The first of the individual stories, which is the hearse driver, uses it, I think, brilliantly. I always think, if people ask me what is your favourite story from the film, they probably expect me to say, the Haunted Mirror or the ventriloquist dummy story. But actually, the hearse driver is my personal favourite. It's the shortest of the stories, but I absolutely love it. And one of the reasons why I love it is because very quick précis of the story, a racing driver crashes, ends up in hospital with his head bandaged, so he's a little bit delirious. And then he has an unusual experience where he's recuperating. He's in the middle of the night or late night. The nurse has said goodnight to him. He's reading a book in his bed. There's a radio playing in the room outside. You can hear the sound of the clock on his bedside table ticking away. And then suddenly, it's almost like the room becomes almost the air is sucked out of the room. It's like a vacuum. The music stops. The clock stops. The clock stops at a different time, which itself is weird. And there's a shot of him getting up out of the bed. For some reason, he's compelled to walk to the windows with these sort of drawn curtains. And you just see this shot of him kind of from behind, and the lighting is astonishing. And then you get this quick shot of about 2 seconds of just these curtains sort of flapping gently in the evening breeze. Just hardly perceptible movement. And I just think it's one of the most chilling individual little shots I can think of in cinema, because you think,
what is he going to see when he opens those curtains? Of course,
Yeah.
it's a Victorian hearse in broad daylight, no less. It's just totally weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Is, nobody leaps out and stabs him or anything like that. It's just this unnerving experience. As far as we know, it's the middle of the night, and then suddenly it's broad daylight, and he's looking at this Victorian hearse. Yeah, it's really well done. I really like that segment as well. But then we've got the haunted mirror, I think, and you can see echoes in that in a lot of, you can see kind of echoes of that in some of the Amicus films as well. It's very, very.
Oh, absolutely. Well,
great.
Don't forget, you've got the Christmas story between the hearse driver and the haunted mirror, which is it being close to Christmas. Is worth mentioning that one. I think again, that doesn't get quite the love that it deserves, but it's very unsettling at times as well.
Yeah, I mean that's very. I mean, again, you've got. The hearse story, which is it's like a very sort of very short version of a kind of Amicus style storyline that you'd get later on. They'd play around with those kind of images, definitely. But the Christmas story, I think, is the Christmas party is very much that's. Or that's kind of leading in. It's very M.R. James-ish, It's that kind, or it's like M.R. James stroke Dickens kind of Christmas story. It's that kind of vibe. So
it's the one story that's based on real events, because the constant murder case, which the novel The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher was written many years later about the same case.
Yeah,
but that also has a moment of quiet in it as well, when Sally Ann Howes enters the attic room and she's just looking around the room, and all she can see is this small child weeping in a chair. It's a nightmare image, isn't it? But it's subtle, and again, just absolute goosebumps.
And who doesn't really like a story about some kids creeping around a big house and finding an attic room and a ghostly weeping child? Come on. Like I say, the haunted mirror, I think, that's a really, I mean, again, okay, it works out okay sort of in the end, but it's so fucking, it could go either way. It's such a horrible situation that these characters are, why, and it does play right, even because if it wasn't necessarily placed in this film where we know it's about supernatural stories, there is another way. That story could turn out a different way. This is simply a guy having a nervous breakdown, and that is an interesting thing in itself. I mean, all of these kind of, it's interesting. Yeah, like you say, it's interesting. We've got the architect as a character, but it's also very interesting to have the psychiatrist. It's kind of dealing with the, that kind of 20s, 30s obsession with Freud and all that kind of stuff. So that's the hangover from that. But it is also, a lot of these stories could be interpreted as nervous breakdowns of various characters. It could all be just a fan.
As I said, it's a lot of this is about sort of the malehood in the 40s and people, men returning from war, and what role they have in society to return to. And I think there's quite a lot of that in sort of most of the stories. Actually, my favourite bit in The Haunted Mirror. This is again another story that kind of rapidly spirals into something bizarre and scary. But my favourite bit in that is when he's just had the mirror, this antique mirror, delivered, and he's standing in front of it with his wife, played by Googie Withers, and he just says something like, "What was that?" And you don't on the screen, you don't actually see anything. You just see his reflection, but he just looks to one side. It's like, you see something, and that's don't do this. For again, the imagination starts to go into overdrive. What did he see? And of course, we eventually do see what he sees. But before you see what he sees, you imagine what he's seeing, and that is more scary to me.
Yeah, it's almost a kind of Lovecraftian idea, isn't it? This thing that's not on the page, it's not on the screen, it's somewhere in between what they're saying and your imagination. And that is because no one can portray on screen something worse than you can imagine. So that is always the best way to go. It's a brilliant sort of segment. I love the haunted mirror because it's, again, being a horror fan and having watched From Beyond the Grave and various other things, but particularly this one as well. Always buy a new mirror, folks. Don't buy an antique mirror, no matter how pretty it looks and how nice it might look in your Art Nouveau bedroom. It's not worth the hassle. It really is.
No way, not. Definitely not. It's kind of, it did for antique mirrors what Psycho did for showers.
Yes, it did. Yeah. I think we've got to talk about what I think. Well, that is definitely I love all these segments, but obviously the most sort of famous and probably the one that's talked of the most is the final segment, followed by the hell that follows that, which is the ventriloquist dummy starring a young Michael Redgrave, which is still, despite how many times people have said this and despite how many times people have hyped this up, I'd still say it's one of the most terrifying stories ever put to camera, because and Michael Redgrave in that.
His acting ability, he was almost acting out of time there for me. I look at his performance, the nuance of his performance, even compared to his fellow players in any given scene. And he's doing things with his face and his hands and his body that you wouldn't see in cinema really for another 10, 15, 20 years, particularly. There's a level of subtlety that he brings to that part, which is really challenging because the whole thing is no more than about 20 minutes long. So there's not a lot of, sort of screen time to play with, and yet the kind of the gravitas that he brings to it with his performance is quite astonishing, actually. It's no surprise that it's many people's favorite segment.
Well, because like the other segments, it can go either way, and actually, if we examine the ventriloquist dummy segment, we can either accept that Michael Redgrave's character's gone mad, or we can accept that this is a supernatural occurrence. And actually, I think the cop out is to accept it as a supernatural occurrence. That lets you off the hook slightly. Actually, to accept that he is mad, that is the more frightening reading of this, because it is such a brilliant performance. It's so terrifying. I don't even know. Like you said, this is before Hammer. This is before any of that stuff. It's like you said, it's out of time, because we'd had all the kind of Universal horror stuff, and that's brilliant. Don't get me wrong, I love Karloff, Lugosi, and all that, but this is something. This is, before Psycho. This is kind of like, this is madness writ large on the screen, and it is really chilling.
I agree with you. It's best read as basically a massive psychiatric breakdown. But in thinking about it from that perspective, you then, as a viewer, you almost have to think, well, okay, what I'm actually seeing this from that perspective. It's almost like I'm inhabiting the mind of this character as he's experiencing the world and what's happening, which in itself is just a scary thing, and really, again, really quite ahead of its time, I think. Not unique, but I think certainly ahead of its time in many respects. So I think it's, I absolutely love it. It's just the most wonderful thing. So it's the one I have to pick out to show to anybody who was not familiar with the film. It's clearly the one that you'd have to sort of show to people.
Yeah, I mean, and obviously it kind of set up that idea. Obviously we get magic later on and a few other things that kind of tap into this possessed ventriloquist dummy stroke man having a nervous breakdown with a doll type stories, all of this kind of, I mean, even stuff like Chucky, Child's Play is kind of tapping into that. It's very much, whether Tom Holland was aware of Dead of Night or not, I don't know, but it's got that vibe. But
it's Uncanny Valley, isn't it, really? I mean, it's one of the first examples of that sort of thing.
Absolutely,
Animacy from inanimacy, something springing to life when you're not expecting it. It's just automatically terrifying.
Yeah, and then kind of when you think it can't get any worse, we get this mad ending, which is kind of taking where, Walter Craig realizes he's in some sort of trapped in a nightmare, but we as the audience get fragments of other stories mixed together with other stories, and everything gets, it's almost like everything we've seen before has been sort of compacted and then thrown up on the screen, and it's sort of everything and it's not often, in fact, it's so rare that a film handles the idea of a nightmare well. David Lynch does it brilliantly, and a few other directors do it great. But this is a really early example of getting it absolutely right. It's not, because it's not something. It doesn't do the obvious things. And seeing the ventriloquist dummy actually get up and start running across the screen and things. It's terrifying. It really is. Those last scenes are just, they are literally a nightmare. It's a horror show.
They are. That very scene, actually, where Hugo, the dummy, gets up off the chair and walks across the cell to strangle Walter Craig. I think often when I used to watch it initially, your eye fixes onto the dummy. But actually, if you look in the centre of the picture, at the cell door, you have a lot of the audience who were at the ventriloquist show, and you see that again as part of this concertina bit at the end there. They're kind of really weirdly crowded around the edges of the store, peering in.
Yes.
And that was really unnerving little element to that particular section at the end there, which you don't necessarily always notice. And then, of course, he gets strangled by Hugo and wakes up, strangling himself a little bit in his bed back in London. And then it all starts again.
Yeah, and he gets a call, and he's got to go to this house, and we pull up with the same place that we started. It's a masterpiece. It really, really is. That word is overused. I know it is, but it really is a fucking British masterpiece. It kind of just sets the bar for British horror films. I'm not going to say that without this you wouldn't have Hammer, because I think you probably would have had Hammer films, but it does set the bar. And I know horror fans are aware of this, and horror fans talk about this, and it is something we enjoy, but it is a pity that it's not enjoyed by more people or appreciated by more people. Not because it's a necessarily horror film, but just because it's a brilliantly constructed piece of cinema.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of people are going to be put off by its very age, and just maybe the kind of the initial impression you get from the acting styles that are presented on screen. And I think that can be a bit too much for some younger audiences, quite honestly. But if they just persevere, my God, does it reward a viewing. It really, really does. I completely agree. It's an absolute masterpiece.
So, Jez, where can people get your books from?
Oh, well, I mean, there's the obvious conglomerate beginning with A, which we won't mention. But if for the Dead of Night book and the other books that are published by Liverpool University Press, so I wrote one on Thing in the same Devil's Advocates range, and also I co-wrote a book on Seconds, the John Frankenheimer film from '66, again in Liverpool University Press's Constellations range. They're available through Liverpool's website at competitive rates, I think. Depends how much you want to pay, really. So those are the main ones that I've had published with my name on the cover. I've contributed a variety of other things to other people's books, quite recently, actually. So Emma Westwood, who I co-wrote the second book with, she wrote a book, or she edited a book about Bride of Frankenstein. And I've got a chapter in that, which was really, really nice to be invited to do that. What else recently? So I've got a chapter in The Ravage Companion to Folk Horror, which came out a couple of months ago. That was nice to do that one. I've got, I think, next April, from the same editing team, they've got a book coming out called Horrifying Children. And in that, I write a chapter which is all about watching TV in the early 1970s when you're poorly off school at home and you've taken some sleepy cough mixture and watching daytime TV programs when you're off school. Imagine writing 5,000 words on that.
Yes. You're stumbling across these weird things when you're sort of drugged on 70s medication, when you're poorly round at your nice nans. That, you know,
I think it's a surprisingly commonly shared experience.
Oh yeah. Now, did you? Am I making this up? I get confused and I get things mixed up. Did you contribute something to Scarred for Life?
Yes, but not quite yet. So I've actually written a new essay about the thing, which will be appearing in volume 3 when it finally comes out. So any Scarred for Life aficionados will know that it's been forever since the second one came out. When's the third one coming out? Well, Dave and Steve are taking their merry old time to do it. They are working on it. It will come out when it's ready, and it'll be fantastic. So when that does come out, yes, I will have a piece in that volume when it finally appears. Hopefully next year.
I'm very jealous. I'd love to write something for Scarred for Life. I fucking love those books. If anybody's not entirely sure about Scarred for Life, I mean, they've got a Facebook page and a website and all this kind of stuff, but they initially did a book about the 1970s called Scarred for Life, and he's looking at things like public information films, Doctor Who, Children of the Stone, all these things that were kind of specifically made for kids, but were absolutely terrifying. But also it looks at, like, you know, you sort of the dodgy sitcoms and stuff like that. It's brilliant. And then the Scarred for Life Volume 2 is looking at similar sort of stuff, but with the 80s. And it's very, very detailed. It's brilliantly written, and it's not just kind of throwaway sort of nostalgia. It's really well researched, and it's a fantastic read. I can't recommend those books enough.
And they're really thick as well. They're real doorstop.
Yeah,
books,
they definitely are. Yeah. Okay, so obviously, as usual, please, visit our Facebook page, join in, talk to us. If you do listen to these podcasts, I mean, we're charging you nothing. You've got these podcasts for note. So if you can, and if you do enjoy these podcasts, please give us a review. Some people have written some nice reviews, which is great, because it really helps with, like, distribution and things like that. I know it's a really boring thing to say, but it does, because I love doing these podcasts and I like to continue to do it. So yeah, if you can help, give us a review, that would be brilliant. It just remains for me to say thank you to my guest this week, Jez Conolly. Thank you for coming on, and it's short notice as well, so I really, really appreciate that. So thank you, and it's been a fascinating episode, and thanks for the choice, because I do love Dead of Night.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to talk about it. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
So remember to call round next time. Make yourself at home. You look like you're dying for a nice cup of tea for terror.
And remember, my friend, future events such as these will affect you in the future.